My name's George Hulse. I'm the president of the Toowong sub-branch RSL. I've got a story for you about the World War I combat engineers, and I'm sure you've never heard this story before. And the reason why I'm bringing it to you is that we're building a memorial bridge to commemorate those combat engineers of World War I. My name's George Hulse. I'm a retired Lieutenant Colonel from the Corps of Royal Australian Engineers, and I'm the president of the Toowong sub-branch RSL. I'm also president of the 1st Field Squadron group, and we're a Vietnam-based association, and we're also called the Tunnel Rats back then, so that's my background. What I want to talk to you today is about a couple of incidents that happened in World War I that very few people are aware of, and yet had such a profound effect on one of the major battles ever fought in World War I. And this profound effect was delivered by Australian combat engineers in the field. So if I was to lift up a little map, I know it's very busy, but it's an actual battle map of World War I that our commanders had of where the Australians were, and on our right were the Canadians, on our left were the British. There's the Somme River up the top of the map, and right through the middle of the map you'll see a dead straight line, and that's a road that was put there by the Romans almost 2,000 years ago. It's still there today. So it undulates up and down, but it goes in a dead straight line. And it was along this line that the Australians advanced on the 8th of August 1918. It was the Battle of Amiens, and what happened was that at 4:20 in the morning, all the British and French and Americans rose up as one and attacked the Germans. The 8th of August 1918 was the day that General Ludendorff, the boss of the German army, said this is the black day of the German army in this war. He knew he was going backwards, and there was no other way for him to go, because on the 8th of August he was totally surprised and overwhelmed by the size of the attack that hit his forward infantry units, his artillery, you name it, they all got bashed. And at 4:20 in the morning, it was a pea super coming out of the Somme River. And so our troops, when they advanced, could hardly see anything anyway, but they were advancing behind an enormous British barrage from the artillery. And as they advanced forward, they were given 4 days to go from their start line, somewhere near Villers-Bretonneux, to an end line, which was called Harbonnières, and they did it in 6 hours. So they left before breakfast and they got to their end point before lunch on the same day. So they really stormed all over the German troops on the 8th of August 1918. But a lot of things happened on the way. And I'd like to just share with you now a couple of engineer stories, combat engineer stories. And the combat engineers are the guys that sometimes go out in front of the infantry, they go out in front of the armoured units, they protect the artillery, and what they do is they get rid of enemy mines, barbed wire, entanglements, obstacles, they search bunkers, they go down tunnels. That's what the combat engineer does. And of course the engineers build roads and other things and supply water, but the combat engineer is right up the forward edge with the infantry. And so on the 8th of August, we were advancing along the Somme River, and there was a real need to cross the Somme River with bridges. And so they had assault bridges with the combat engineers to cross the Somme River. And one particular group of engineers was sent forward, and they came to a little town called Cerisy. And Cerisy is a gorgeous little town down in the valley on the Somme River. But above Cerisy is what's called the Chipperley Spur, and that's a big hill that had lots of Germans and lots of guns. And in the first bombardment at 4:20 in the morning, the British guns had very little effect on the Germans on Chipperley Hill. So the Germans on Chipperley Hill had Cerisy dead in their sights. And when our lads arrived and the British arrived following the Somme River, the Germans were still active on Chipperley Hill. So one of our lieutenants took his troop. In those days they were called sections, but nowadays we call them troops of engineers. So he took his troop down to the Somme River, and he was told that he had to build 3 bridges, and he had to do it really quickly. And one bridge he had to build was called Cherry Bridge, and it was expected that Cherry Bridge was an old French bridge which would have been blown up by the German engineers. And the next bridge was called Sapper Bridge, which was going to be a brand new bridge. made of floating pontoons, and the other one was another bridge called Chipperley Bridge, and we knew that had been blown up by the German engineers. So when this lieutenant, Second Lieutenant Ralph Hunt, arrives with his troop of engineers, he comes to Cherry Bridge, and much to his surprise and delight, it's still standing there, no Germans anywhere near it, and they hadn't blown it up. So he seized it, crossed the bridge really quickly with his troop, and then went towards where he was going to put Sapper Bridge. But he didn't make it. He went a couple of 100 metres along with his bodyguard, if you like, his personal guard, a sapper, George Hook, and what happened was that they were caught by machine guns, and George Hook was very badly wounded, but Ralph Hunt wasn't scratched at all. So the lieutenant saw his soldier down on the ground, ran forward, grabbed him, and ran back with him over his shoulders. And there were machine gun bullets kicking up all around him, but unfortunately Sapper George Hook died of wounds, but Lieutenant Ralph Hunt wasn't scratched at all in that whole engagement. So he got back to Cherry Bridge and he thought, well, we're not putting Sapper Bridge across because it's smack in front of a German gun and we're just not going to make it. So he detailed off one of his corporals and 6 sappers and said, you guys hold the bridge, we're going to go and find somewhere else to put Sapper Bridge. And he left. And not long after he left, all hell broke loose to the north, about 500 metres north of this bridge. And the corporal thought, oh, this is not good karma. I'd better send 2 sappers up to find out what's going on. So he picked up Sapper Dean and Williams and said, go up there and find out if it's a danger to us. So away they went, 2 engineer sappers on their own, rifles and their kit. So they went through some boggy ground, and when they finally closed up to where 2 German machine guns were machine gunning everything out of the London Fusiliers, and the London Fusiliers were copping a hiding, and they were protected, the German guns were protected by a platoon of infantry, German infantry, and they were on the high ground, and the Brits were down on the low ground near the Somme River, and they were trapped in the crossfire of these 2 machine guns. So these 2 sappers looked up the hill and thought, we can't just leave this is bad, so we better do something about it. So using soldier skills, they crept up behind where the German machine guns were, and 2 sappers rushed them, throwing grenades, firing their rifles and screaming and bansheeing something loud. And the German lieutenant, when he looked over his shoulder, thought he'd been surrounded. So he surrendered rather than have all his soldiers killed. He didn't realise it was just 2 Australian sappers that had attacked his position from the rear. And as soon as all the hands went up, of course the Brits went forward quickly and captured the 2 guns and thanked the 2 Australians very much for their effort. So the 2 Australians were put up for the Victoria Cross, and it was Victoria Cross time, there's no question about it. But as it turns out, the highest level of the generals decided that they wouldn't get a Victoria Cross, they would get the Distinguished Conduct Medal, which is 1 medal below the Victoria Cross. Not bad, but not good for us. So these 2 sappers, when they came back out of the war, they both survived the war, disappeared into the community, and no one ever knew what they'd done. So here's 2 likely Victoria Crosses. They'd saved countless numbers of British lives and took a tremendous risk to go in and do what they did, but they weren't adequately, I think, decorated for their effort. So Cherry Bridge is still there to this day. That's what it looks like. I crossed it a couple of months ago before COVID-19 struck, and it's still there. It survived 2 world wars, and it's very much like the Eiffel design on things. So if ever you're in Cersei, you can cross the Cherry Bridge, as it was called in the First World War. So we go on. The day goes on. The Australians are roaring forward, and they get to a place called La Motte or Hulse. And there are lots of underground dugouts that the Germans are working out of. And one is a command post, and it's under the main road. And so it was a case of engineers, dugouts, your job, down you go. And so a group of sappers went down, burst through the front door, and much to everybody's amazement, including the Australian sappers, there sitting down for breakfast are 5 senior German officers. they had no idea that their entire formation had been overrun by the Australians. So they were sat down to breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning or whatever, thinking, oh, fine day, we'll get on with the war later on. And next thing, here's a bunch of Australian sappers saying, gotcha. And of course, the sappers made short work of the breakfast, didn't they? So they handed over these 5 German senior officers to the infantry, and the show rolled on. And as they went forward, further on during that morning, they came to a place called Bayonne-Villers. That's probably not how the French say it, but it's as good as I can manage. So Bayonne-Villers was being very hastily abandoned by the Germans. They realised that something big was about to hit them, so they left. Now, on one particular headquarters of the Germans left, they left all their maps behind, secret maps, operational maps, all their stores, all their dumps, all the stuff that was happening with the German engineers was all left behind. And so some sappers went in, they picked up all these lists and found out where every nut and bolt and railway line was that the Germans had notated and left for them almost like a gift. But they were in such a hurry to get out, they didn't have time to burn it, which is probably what they should have done. Thank goodness they didn't. It's probably a perfectly good chateau, but the Australian sappers captured that stuff. When they went on a little bit, their chief, the Australian Army Chief Engineer, came down personally and thanked them and congratulated them because it was one of the best intelligence finds they'd found for many, many months. And this was a beauty because now, instead of asking our engineer stores people to put forward all that engineer equipment, they just went forward into the German dumps and captured it and brought it back and used it. So our roads were totally choked, and if you can call them roads. So it saved our people a lot of time, effort and energy just by capturing the German stores that they'd overrun and using those. So then they go on to Amiens. And here we are, 6 hours downrange, and by the 8th hour after crossing the line, our soldiers had Amiens, and it was the 31st Infantry Battalion that captured Amiens. So they pulled up there. That was as far as they had to go. It was supposed to have taken them 4 days to get there, and they got there by lunchtime of the day that they left the start line. But when they got there, they looked across no man's land, and only 200 yards, about 200 metres, ahead of them, they saw this absolutely enormous gun on a railway line. It was so big that they couldn't fire it like field artillery on dirt. It had to be fired off a railway line. Huge gun. So it was just too big a temptation to leave, because what had happened is the Germans had abandoned their gun because they were under fire and they were being bombed. So they abandoned their gun temporarily. But the Australians realised that here was a chance. This was a huge option here. And so 3 engineers, one a lieutenant who already had the Military Cross from 1917, his name was Lieutenant George Burrows, MC. He gathered together Sapper Les Strawn, who'd been an engine driver in Western Australia, and Sapper John Palmer. And they had a little pact together, and they spoke to the infantry and said, we're going to rush across no man's land and we're going to take that gun. And so I don't know what the conversation would have been, but the infantry captain would have probably said, fill your boots. And away they went across no man's land, being fired at by the Germans, who did not want that gun captured. But they got to the gun, and then they found they had a few problems. So Sapper Strawn and Sapper Palmer started shoveling coal into the firebox to get some steam up, and the lieutenant went round throwing switches because all they had was passenger carriages behind the locomotive, and what they wanted was the gun. They couldn't move the gun without the locomotive. So they disconnected the carriages. They then pushed forward with their locomotive, hooked up the gun and its limber with all the ammunition, and then shunted backwards and forwards over all these points until they got it as far away from the Germans and as close to the Australians as the tracks would allow them. And then that night, the rest of the field company came forward, and taking the tracks from the back of the train, they put it to the front of the train, and they did that all night long until come morning, that gun was well and truly in Australian hands, and there was no way the Germans were going to get their gun back. And that was called the Amiens gun. It was called that because from where it was captured, it was actually firing shells that were hitting Amiens. And a 280mm shell is a huge bomb that lands and does a lot of damage. So they'd captured the gun. So what happened was that it was taken in as a war trophy, but it was taken in by the 31st Battalion, and then it was taken by the British as a war trophy. And our general decided that he wanted the barrel from that to come back to Canberra, and he took it. And so the barrel came back to Canberra and is at the Australian War Memorial as we speak. So this was the gun in Amiens when it was captured. As you can see, it's an enormous piece of kit. It would have gone off with a huge bang at both ends. And this is a photograph of the barrel of that gun at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. So it's the same barrel. That's the Amiens gun. And that was captured by 3 sappers. But if you read the history, you'll find that the 3 sappers have been written out of history and that it was captured by the 31st Battalion. And actually the sappers didn't mind because we're always under command. We're under command of the armoured, or we're under command of the infantry. And so we owe our allegiance to our battalion. And so the sappers wouldn't have minded if 31st Battalion said, well, it's our gun, because they would have been under command of the 31st Battalion. But history now records that it was captured by infantry units, but the reality is it was captured by 3 engineer soldiers from the Corps of Australian Engineers. So when we looked at all that, and we tried to find some traces of what happened to George Burroughs, Les Strawn, John Palmer, where are they? You know, where did they go? What was their history? They just drifted back like Williams and Dean into just obscurity. There was no story about it anywhere. So we thought in the 1st Field Squadron group that, you know, these were our forebears. These were the guys who formed the DNA of our corps. These were the guys that gave us a backbone in Vietnam. These were the guys that, if you like, put the spirit into the 1st Field Squadron guys that went to Afghanistan, the guys that are in Iraq and places like that. So we owe them something and we should do something for them. And there's no monument to the Corps of Engineers anywhere in the world. So we decided we'd do something about that. And we thought the best place for it would be in the very ground where they did all this stuff, and that was in Amiens in France. And we thought the best date to do it would be any anniversary of the 8th of August, the first day of the Battle of Amiens back in 1918. But of course you can't just build monuments in other people's countries, so we had to go to the Amiens City Council, and we put the idea to the Amiens City Council. They loved it. They love Australians, New Zealanders and Canadians particularly, and the Brits in Amiens, because they believe that the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux that happened on Anzac Day 1918 was what saved Amiens, and that was fought by mainly Australians. So they have a very soft spot for Australians. And then when we captured the Amiens gun that was giving them such a hiding from, you know, all that distance away, they really galvanised themselves to Australians. So when we said, excuse me, can we put a monument here? Well, they said, well, what sort of a monument do you want? And we said, well, you know, we're engineers. And what we don't want is a bronze statue or a plaque up against the side of a wall. We want to do something useful. So what we'd like to do is build a military bridge across one of your crossings that's essential, that you can use. And it can double, both as a monument to the Corps of Australian Engineers of World War I, and also people can cross it and use it as a useful piece of, if you like, streetscape for Amiens. Well, again, the Amiens people were delighted. They found a crossing over the Somme River. It's called the Somme Canal in that area, but it joins the central business district of Amiens City to their magnificent botanical gardens. And so we designed a bridge, and the idea came up between myself and Brigadier Wayne Budd, who was the head of Corps of Engineers in those days, and we thought a Bailey Bridge looks military, and so we'll suggest that to the French. They loved it. There are a few little design things that we've got to do to make it safe so that kids and dogs don't fall through the hole in the Bailey Bridge, so it's quite safe for everybody to cross, and that the inclinations, if there were any, would accept wheeled vehicles such as wheelchairs and bicycles and things of that nature. And we finally came up with a place and a design, and of course the bridge was ordered, and we were supposed to have dedicated it on the 8th of August this year, but COVID-19 got in the way, and so it's going to be dedicated and it'll be built in 2021 and then dedicated on the 8th of August 2021. But of course, there's always that big question mark. Who is going to pay for this bridge? And after having put out some tenders for people to give us quotes on supply of this bridge, we had one manufacturer, brand new bridge with a 20-year guarantee, who could deliver it and put it in place, and we could have it built and in place for 70,000 Australian dollars, and that's the cheapest bridge I've ever built in my life. But of course, we've got to raise the money. So we've been fundraising now for a little while, and unfortunately what happened was that when our fundraising got started, it was just before the bushfires. And so we had a groundswell of support, but then when the bushfires struck, naturally and quite clearly, people were going to put their money towards bushfire relief and save the koala funds and so forth. And then, of course, along came COVID-19. People were losing their jobs everywhere, and we knew that our fundraising was going to stall, and it has. So we're in desperate need of some folk to make some donations towards this bridge. It'll be a bridge that'll be in place for hundreds of years to come. It'll be there for generations. It's going to be a monument like all the other monuments that we've got. And the beauty of Amiens, it's only 20 kilometres away from the Australian War Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux. So it's on your way to Villers-Bretonneux, and you can have a look at this bridge. Better still, you can touch it and cross it if you want to. And on the dedication day of the 8th of August 2021, the French, or the Amiens City Council, have given us approval to march with our slouch hats on and our whatever, either uniform or suit that you'd like to wear with all our medals, and also to wear the medals of our First World War heroes on our right-hand side, on our right breast, and to march down the Rue des Déportés, however you say that in French, into the Rue de la Résistance, which I think is about right. And on the way, we'll have a saluting dais where we'll salute those that have sponsored us, and of course the Amiens City Council. And then we'll get to the bridge, where we'll have a formal dedication of the bridge, and there'll be ribbon cutting at the bridge, followed by what's called a French reception, which I'm looking forward to. I've never been to one, but I'm told they're quite spectacular, to really inaugurate the bridge and wet the baby's head, as it were, going forward. So that's what's happening. And I'd just say that if anybody would like to help us with funding this bridge, it's easy. If you go to the website, onefieldsappers.org, you'll see a tab there called Amiens Bridge. You can click on that and you'll get all the details that you need about why we're doing this. But if you'd like to make a donation, so there's our BSB, there's our account number, and if you'd like to do that, make sure that you put your name in the details box, because we want to record everybody's name and the amount of donation they made going forward, if you like, in a time module, so that everybody knows who it was that made a donation to help that bridge a reality. And that's the story of the Amiens Bridge. It's going to be a Bailey Bridge, and it's going to look like this, something similar to that. It'll be a jungle green bridge, as it has to be. But as you can see, there's some holes there between the Bailey panels, and where you see those X type things, each one of those is a panel. It's 3 metres long. And we have to put a safety fence in there to make sure that nothing goes through into the Somme River. The French are very protective of their Somme River. They want nothing going into the water, and we're going to ensure that's the case by having safety things on it, but it won't detract from the nature or the image of the bridge itself. So that's what a Bailey Bridge looks like, and that's what we're going to put up there. And that's the story of the Amiens Bridge and why we're going to do it, and why it's a monument, and why it's a monument to the Australian engineers. And we've called it the Bridge of Friendship between Australia and France, dedicated to every Australian engineer unit of World War I. But there's another story I'd like to add, and that is that we have an Amiens here in Queensland. Now, the Amiens in Queensland's only got 200 people in it, but it's got one very vibrant group. which is the Amiens Historical Society led by Professor Roger Willis. And he's agreed to build, and he's already done it, build a small replica Bailey Bridge in Amiens, Queensland. And so the symbolism of both the bridges will be that the Amiens Bridge in Queensland will join figuratively with the Amiens Bridge in Amiens, France, to symbolise the coming together of two nations over a very noble cause at a very difficult time. And so those two bridges will be connected through the heart, if not by any other means, and they will both be dedicated to the Australian engineers of World War I. And I hope you've enjoyed that story, and I'm sure very few people know the history of the Amiens gun and the fact that you can cross Cherry Bridge, and that two sappers really should have won the Victoria Cross, but the bureaucracy at the time decided that they shouldn't have it, and all of them have disappeared into obscurity and nobody knows their story, and we're going to try and put that right.